Okay, Kathy, go ahead whenever you're ready.
So good morning, everyone. Kathy Robertson, General Manager with Community Futures Cowichan. So on behalf of ourselves at Community Futures, the Duncan Cowichan Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development Cowichan, we're pleased to have MLA Sonia with us today. Her webinar is all part of an initiative that we've come together on called Cowichan Strong, which is our attempt to help bring the most relevant information and resources to our business community as we all try and navigate COVID and the impacts to our business. So with Sonia here today, we're going to get a firsthand account on the province's response and supports to the business community and our community in general. So a great opportunity to get to know more detail, and of course an opportunity to ask questions to her directly. So with that, I will hand it over to Sonia.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity, and thank you to everybody who's on the line. I think it's really important that we're having these conversations right now and really looking in the context of the crisis that we're facing in the immediate time, but also working together to think of a pathway and work together to build that pathway for a more resilient future, particularly for businesses. And so that's why it's so important that we're joining in this together. And I've heard from business people in the riding. I've contacted and reached out to several who have contacted our office and heard firsthand just what an incredible struggle this is for people right now. And while we're doing a great job in BC and particularly on Vancouver Island, following the direction of the provincial health officer, and it's fantastic that we are not seeing the potential impacts to our healthcare system that could have happened had we not flattened the curve so well. I recognize that has come at a significant cost to businesses in particular, and small and medium-sized businesses. And so what I want to start with today really is putting into the chat really just one sentence about what are the biggest challenges that you're facing as business owners right now and as business people. And because it's going to be so important that as we move through this, that we're really informed by your actual experiences and what your challenges are. And so that can really help us in the work that we're doing in the legislature, advocating to government the kinds of things that we would like to see them doing and initiatives we'd like to see them taking. So I'll proceed with the presentation, and as I see those coming in, it'll be great to hear directly from you about what are those really significant challenges that you're facing right now. And I'll go to the next slide, Maeve. So I think starting with a real recognition of the contribution of small and medium businesses to BC's economy. Small businesses up to 49, we often hear this said. I'm just getting a quick note. You can hit the chat button at the bottom to open the chat box, and that's how you can send a message. So if you put your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button. So I see Catherine's gotten a message in there, and I'll be monitoring that. Yeah, this is really great. I'm appreciating these messages coming in, so I'll be watching these. But to start with, looking at just how important small and medium businesses are to BC's economy, and this notion of backbone, foundation. I think we see in Duncan and across Cowichan that it is our small businesses, our local businesses that make us a region that is so appealing for both residents and tourists to come here. And I know that when we travel as a family, we always seek out that downtown core where the independent businesses are, because that's what makes a community vibrant and provides its culture. And when I was looking through the stats today and yesterday about particularly the surveys that businesses have been doing in light of COVID, and recognizing that for many, many businesses, the biggest single cost are wages. So then asking the question, like, what does that really mean in a community? Well, that means that it is small and medium businesses that are actually putting that money into our communities and keeping that local economy going. And we, I think, deeply undervalue how important that is. So small businesses, as we know, make 98% of total businesses in the private sector, as they have for almost a decade. And since 2014, they've contributed an average of 77 billion, or 34% to our provincial GDP. And that's, BC's ranked #1 for that, well above the national average of 30% of GDP from small businesses. So really recognizing and understanding the importance of this sector. There's over 500,000 small businesses in BC. They employ 1.1 million people, and it's 44% of employment in the province. And so the impact of COVID cannot be understated when we're talking about half of the people employed, nearly half of the people employed in this province are surely feeling some level of direct impact from the changes we've had to make on COVID. So on the next slide, when we look at Vancouver Island's context, and we know that Vancouver Island has a fantastic and strong small business community, second only to the Lower Mainland in the total number of businesses. But that being said, the growth rate of small businesses on Vancouver Island don't match the Lower Mainland and the rest of the province. In 2018, the statistics tell us that the majority of small businesses were focused on professional and business services, trade, other services, construction, health, and education. And the sectors that are seeing growth are construction, high-tech, tourism, professional, and business services. And then I'm going to go to what we've heard, and I'm actually going to switch over to some of the comments that I've seen in the chat box already. So we have absolutely heard as a caucus, as MLAs, our staff, the magnitude of the impacts on small business. And from the survey that came out yesterday of more than 1,000 BC businesses, nearly half of those which have remained open believe that they could only survive for up to 3 months. And that is a devastating picture of what is potentially happening for businesses across the province. And I think if I look at some of the comments that have already come in, access to the relief for businesses, the application process is not available yet online, from Catherine. And I know that this has been a struggle, and I will be getting to the resource sections and have the links up later in the presentation. And I know that it's been, the goalposts have been moving fairly regularly, and that week over week, the announcements come out and they change. And oftentimes it's been because governments, and particularly the federal government, have noted that there are significant gaps in their first rollout of supports, and that they've had to expand those supports in order to not have the gaps be so significant. But also, of course, when there are millions, literally millions of people applying for support, these processes get overloaded very quickly, and the resources needed to get them moving can be incredibly challenging. From Farmsgate Food and Catering, our business is facing a significant delayed impact with events being canceled this summer. It'd be great to see some sort of action or recognition from the government to the businesses that are going to have a delayed impact from COVID. And this is such an important point to raise. And we don't know, this is the thing that the health officers have been saying from the beginning, and the experts have been saying, is we don't know how long this is going to go, but the conservative estimates are that we are 18 months to 2 years before there's a vaccination, and that the lack of really deep understanding of this virus, because it is such a new virus, and this was one of the conversation points when I was on the town hall with Dr. Stanwyck last night, the research that's underway to catch up to understand what this virus is and how it works is brand new. And so there are no really clear answers to how long this is going to take. And so understanding that particularly seasonal businesses or businesses that are dependent on events, like so much of our food service industry and our tourism industry, that these impacts are not necessarily the most felt right now, that they are going to extend and they're going to be the most painful through the season when we are used to that influx of people and demand. And so this is, I think, seeing that, you know, when we talk about supports being 1 month or 3 months, that is not going to be sufficient for a lot of businesses to survive, and that has to be a consideration. Gretchen, for Cowichan Hospice, the biggest current challenge is reaching out to support people living with advanced illness in long-term care or hospitals. We've been able to connect with other palliative and grieving clients who are at home. The loss of fundraising revenue will have a real impact over time. So far, have canceled Real Alternatives, a golf tournament, and likely the Cycle of Life tour. On the positive side, construction of the Cowichan Hospice House continues safely and steadily. And this is the nonprofit sector certainly is reeling right now from the impacts to you know, being unable to fundraise in ways that we typically fundraise, which is put the fun into fundraising, coming together and being together, but also that people are rightly deeply concerned about their own economic futures, and therefore in a place where fundraising is going to be much more challenging for anybody in this current situation. Lisha asks about financial stimulus to help businesses recover once the economy reopens. And will there be stimulus for young or innovative entrepreneurs who are interested in opening new businesses when the economy reopens? There was an article I just read the other day in Saturday's Globe and Mail about how entrepreneurs are actually going to be the core of the economic recovery. And I couldn't agree more that it is going to take entrepreneurship to guide us out of this. And this is why it's going to be so essential that the conversations that are happening about the recovery from the economic impacts of COVID include entrepreneurs, and not just, you know, not leaving this essential sector out of that conversation. So in terms of financial stimulus to help businesses recover, there's been a lot of talk about in sort of bigger pictures about a kind of a Marshall Plan approach to this, where there is enormous government kind of input into the economic recovery that would include stimulus for small business and entrepreneurs. And this is the part of the conversation that we're so invested in as the Green Caucus. Right now, obviously government is rolling out their packages, and they're doing that in a very timely fashion. And we are very much an opposition party in this part of the economic and health crisis that we're in. Government has stepped up and is doing its job as best it can. On the recovery part, we really intend to be part of that conversation and intend to bring in what we're hearing from our communities and from stakeholders and from entrepreneurs. So I think it's very important. I'm going to switch back to moving on with the presentation and talking about some of the provincial programs, and then come back to these questions, which are so important. And the great thing about this, and I'm sure that Kathy and you'll be able to get me the copies of these questions afterwards, so that I can also share them with our caucus staff as we're moving forward. So when we talk again about what we've heard and what I'm hearing right now, one of our most serious concerns really about, in particular, and I'm going to talk about this, is the tax deferrals and the loans, is that this isn't really a solution for so many. Now I'm just getting a message that I glitched. Kathy, can you hear me right now?
Yes, Sonia, sounding good.
Okay, thanks. That programs like tax deferrals and loans they kick the problem down the road. They provide some access to cash flow right now, but to put that burden further down the road at a time when recovery is probably going to be spotty and challenging, and you can't count on the kinds of revenues that you would be able to count on without COVID. It's a real challenge for businesses to be considering taking on more debt or deferring their taxes right now without any kind of sense of knowing what the guaranteed revenues are going to be down the road. And I was a bookkeeper for a long time, my own small business, and doing books for a number of small businesses, mostly around Victoria in my 20s and 30s. And I have that kind of bookkeeper sense of how close to lines businesses tend to operate. And the notion of adding more debt or deferring costs to the down the road is one that would be really challenging for, I know, so many businesses to think about. And so this is where the uncertainty comes in for both businesses and government. And I think that the kind of recovery steps really have to be about how do we create more certainty for what the road looks like forward. And I don't have any magical answers right now, but I can assure you that this is front of mind, and we are putting this at the top of our priority of our work as a caucus to really put solutions in front of government, and bold solutions in front of government that absolutely position business and small and medium-sized business at the center of what a recovery looks like for BC. And I think that that's going to be absolutely essential. And so if we go to the next slide, I'm just got two computers up here. I'm struggling now to get my next slide up. So the provincial responses and tax deferrals. Why is my computer glitching here? Sorry about this. There we go. So here we have the BC COVID-19 support service. So this is operated by Small Business BC. I'm sure that most of you have already accessed this, the dedicated phone line, email, and website for businesses. The BC Hydro COVID-19 assistance program. We have, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. This is my fault. I'm glitching between two computers here. Tax deferrals and delays, here we go. So the deferral of employer health tax payments, and I'm well aware of what a challenge employer health tax payments were before COVID came in. But right now, businesses with a payroll of over 500,000 can defer their employer health tax until September 30th. And we have the provincial business tax filing and payment deadlines, which have been also extended until September 30th. The scheduled April 1st increases to carbon tax, as well as new PST registration requirements on e-commerce, and the implementation of the PST on sweetened drinks delayed until September 30th. So these are our tax deferrals and delays. And as I said, we recognize that this would feel largely like kicking a problem down the road, as opposed to offering a kind of really solid relief that people are feeling they might need right now. The next slide is about the property taxes, and this talks to Maeve, you can move it to the next slide. This talks to, there we go, the property tax reduction and penalty delays. So the government is reducing school property tax rate for commercial properties to achieve a 25% reduction in the total property tax bill, which enhances the 50% reduction. So, and then this is obviously gives a little bit of breathing room, but otherwise, again, pushes the problem down the road, with businesses being unable to pay in the fall. Local government measures addressing cash flow and revenue shortfalls, which authorizes local governments to borrow interest-free from their existing capital reserves to help pay for operating expenses. Delaying the provincial school tax remittances, so that helps with local government cash flow problems, providing local governments with greater flexibility to carry debt for an additional year, but still requiring them to meet their operational costs and required remittances to regional districts, regional health hospital districts, Translink. So if we go to the next slide, and this is where the other resources are, the COVID support, the BC Hydro and Fortis deferrals, flexible payment plans, the WorkSafe BC payment changes that can help out for some time. And the support for individuals through the BC Emergency Benefit and the Enhanced Climate Action Tax Credit. So this is actually money coming to individual pockets. But again, recognizing in all of this that the enormity of this economic shutdown is very hard to consider how any kind of tax deferrals or small payments are going to make it possible for businesses to survive. And I think we need to be very clear on how we're going to build a recovery that actually supports small businesses. I'm just pulling up commercial rent relief. This is something, there's a question here about commercial rent relief, and this is something we've heard a lot about. And so that there's an example in Australia where the government brought out a mandate where owners and renters in commercial properties had to do some negotiations to figure out how to share the burden of this crisis equally, and finding ways of solving the problem around rent relief that didn't result in small businesses being evicted from their locations, which I know we've seen somewhat in BC and across Canada. When the federal government announced that they would be looking at commercial rent relief, and then they said it would be pushed off to government, we are pursuing to the provincial governments. We are absolutely pursuing that conversation with the province in how they're going to approach provincial rent relief, and we will be keeping that again at the front of our efforts with government. When we look at, and this comes to the end, and I'm going to come back to the questions that are coming through on the chat. You know, the theme of much of what we're looking at as a caucus is how to build a stronger, more resilient future. And I entered into politics because of a community issue, as everybody knows, the watershed issue in Shawnigan Lake. But it's community that is the driving piece of this, and recognizing how essential it is to have strong, resilient communities to increase the quality of life for all of us who live in these communities. And so, you know, the province announced that there'd be a $1.5 billion for economic stimulus once the pandemic is passed. I think that that's going to be, you know, just a beginning of the kind of stimulus we're going to need to see. And that we are in this new normal, and for a significant amount of time. It's heartening to hear that the plans are being put in place to talk about how to get businesses reopened, the economy moving again. But that will come with adjustments. And so on the radio this morning, just hearing about, for example, restaurants being opened with fewer tables, potentially with servers wearing masks as a matter of course, and with that kind of diminished capacity for volume that often is so important for businesses to be able to hit their revenue targets and to be able to maintain that kind of sustainable income that they need. But I think that what we have to really lean into, and I know that it's hard to even consider the idea of opportunity at a time like this, but leaning into the opportunity that we have to not only look at, you know, how do we solve the crisis that's in the present, but what are the things that have been established in the past that actually haven't worked for businesses, and that would need to see some revisiting. And I come back to that wage issue, and I know that for so many businesses that wages are such a significant part of expenses in their overall operating expenses. And wondering about, you know, we've had this conversation that's come in about basic income, which is basically what's happening right now across the country with the funding coming mostly from the federal government. But can we look at a question of livable income, and what role could government play in supporting businesses to achieve livable income for their employees coming out of this crisis, so that, one, we recognize the incredible value that businesses have in a local community and in a local economy. And we also recognize that the wages that go in, and if those are supplemented to a livable wage for every employee, that just stimulates more economic activity in our communities and can actually benefit everybody. All of the businesses would be benefiting from that kind of approach. I think that, as I've said, small and medium businesses need to be front and center in envisioning the recovery that we're going to have. I think that we all recognize that these are the things that make our communities feel like places that we want to live. These are the places we want to be frequenting. We know the owners. Our kids get jobs at these at businesses that are in our local economy, and it's just so essential that we position, not just because of the community aspect, but just the raw statistical data that tells us that businesses really are essential to the well-being of our economy. So I'm going to move over to some of the more questions that have come up in the chats at this point. So there's the rent relief one. We are a series of micro businesses. This is from Faisal, all affected in some way. We have a food cart that is not operating currently at the farmer's market. I'm a realtor. We have a commercial property that's losing from tenants. Because we are multi-micro, we don't fit the requirements of much of the support. And this is a great example of the kind of gap analysis that needs to be happening, and recognizing that entrepreneurs do not fit into a single category. And I was relieved to hear last week when the extension of support from the federal government moved from a $20,000, down to a $20,000 per year payroll up to 1.5 million. But I do recognize that when there are these businesses that don't fit into easily laid out categories, it can be easy to fall through these cracks. And Faisal, that is one that I will bring forward to our caucus so that we can raise that idea of micro businesses with the government. Gabrielle is asking, since we are talking health, I would like to voice that my greatest concern is when I see so many chemtrails in the sky over the valley. Clean air is our birthright. My partner, I sent you an email and didn't receive acknowledgement. Not sure, our emails go through a bit of a triage, but absolutely clean air. And I think that I applaud the government for the steps they took around burning bans at this time to really put clean air as a priority. And we are all noticing there's definitely fewer planes flying overhead. And as this recovery, a lot of it has been also linked to what is a kind of a recovery that is also building into a green and sustainable future. And when we look at the energy sector, for example, we can really recognize that there was an article in The Guardian yesterday about how clean energy and green energy can absolutely be one of the engines of recovery at the time when we're looking at oil and gas literally being at a negative value on the market right now. And so seeing how we can build that, and I think one of the pieces that Adam and I have really talked about a great deal has been around that resiliency, what goes into creating local resiliency. And as we see, this disruption of a pandemic is significant and global, but we've also had a lot of disruptions in the last few years related to weather events and climate-driven impacts. And so when we have storms with power outages, or when we have floods and fires, how are we adapting in a local way to create the kind of resiliency? And when we look at the example of Sauk First Nation and their energy resiliency that they're creating down there, as well as entrepreneurship, we have the Cowichan solar co-op here, which I know has been facing enormous challenges, as so many clean energy projects, entrepreneurial clean energy projects across BC have faced challenges with BC Hydro. And I think this is one of the places that we want to really recognize there's such opportunity to create that kind of community-based resiliency. But energy and clean energy is definitely at the core of that. Is there a possibility of providing funding for individuals to pursue education in cutting-edge fields like computer science, green technology, online education, and other fields? Lockdown could be an opportunity to shift our workforce to more modern fields. Individuals could study online while in lockdown. That's a fantastic question. I actually, the Shawnigan Eco Village has just put in a funding application for exactly this, for online training available to, particularly to entrepreneurs, that would give the opportunity at this time to get the kind of access, not just to how to use online tools, but to experts who would be, in a forum like this, be able to provide their expertise to people in a forum, in an online session or online training that could help with getting you prepared to be able to shift work out of this. And I know that there are efforts in that, and I think that providing funding and for retraining, for education at a time like this is an essential investment that we are very committed to seeing happening. Small business owners that are both running a business and their own home, how does this impact them in regards to applying for their business and then for their personal applications? Are they combined? It's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I can absolutely put that to our staff to get an answer, and that's from Catherine Worsley, about what is the distinction between if you're running a business out of your home, where are the lines for the expenses, and how to apply for either both the small business support and CERB federally. So I will put that to our staff and get an answer back for that. From Julie, what's the initial thoughts of what the 1.5 billion economic stimulus funds would be used for, i.e. what kinds of projects? Yeah, it's a really great question, Julie. The provincial government put together a kind of starting task force for that. And I know that there have been a few meetings. I don't think anything's been landed on. We have staff from our caucus attending those meetings to get a sense of what's happening. And we are also providing ideas about what stakeholders should be there, what kind of ideas should be put into the mix. And the kind of research, for example, from the innovation commissioners and the emerging economy task force already provides us with some pretty extraordinarily well-researched guides into how we transition to a more modern and sustainable economy, which I think we could kind of apply a lot of those recommendations from those reports and those task force kind of on steroids right now, looking ahead to that. So there hasn't been any decisions made about that 1.5 billion and how it's going to be spent. I think right now where the government is at is really in taking in input from stakeholders. And like I said, we are very closely monitoring that and very committed to the small and medium business aspect of that being front and center for certain. Eric, small and medium-sized business and employees are the economy. Yep. Bailout money to billionaire corporations go straight offshore into tax avoidance havens and do not remain in the country to drive local, provincial, and Canadian economies. Singing from your song sheet, Eric, I think that if there are lessons learned from the bailouts that happened after the 2008 crash, and I remember the conversation being about Wall Street versus Main Street, and it does seem that Wall Street benefited quite a bit more from those bailouts, but the hits to local economies and to businesses were significant. We do not want to repeat those kinds of mistakes. I'm heartened so far at the signals and the steps that have been taken, which really do focus on individuals and on small and medium businesses. I think that there's a long ways to go. I come back to, we were the only caucus to not support a $6 billion subsidy going to one LNG firm. And I think now about if $6 billion in subsidies were to be going in spread around small and medium businesses across the province, the kinds of impacts that could have and the benefits to communities would just be enormous. So I think that absolutely we have to be ensuring that our efforts really do go into the people and the businesses of British Columbia first and foremost. That has to be our priority. My chat box has disappeared. There it is. From Julie, while some banks are deferring payments on their credit cards, there hasn't been any adjustment to the interest rates. Is the government going to pressure them to reduce those rates as well as deferring payments? This question has come up a lot, and I think it's a really valid question. And I know that this is a federal level issue, but it's something that we can continue to add our voice to, as we have been already. That the making of significant interest rates for the credit card companies and the big banks at this point seems unjustified in terms of recognizing that the burden of this crisis really should be shared as equally as it possibly can, and that to put that burden more squarely on those who are in some ways least able to hold the burden, while those who can carry the burden much more easily, like large banks and credit card companies, that's a really essential point and question that we have to be pursuing and pushing to see that change coming. So I don't see, oh, there's Carol. Some NFP have made the decision to close and have volunteer services suspended and or laid off staff. The volunteer directors are struggling and don't have the vision capacity necessarily needed to transition to the organizations forward when this is over. And sadly, with the disengagement of volunteers and staff, we may see some valued community services provided by the not-for-profit volunteer sector. And yeah, the Globe and Mail article that I just read was by a fellow named, his last name is Sachs. He's just written a book about entrepreneurs, and he was talking about the irony of his book about entrepreneurship and small businesses coming out at a time like this. And one of the points he made, which was quite interesting, was how many entrepreneurs are actually shifting their efforts right now to kind of volunteer, community-driven, not-for-profit activities. And I know that the not-for-profit sector is really in distress right now, and it is an important sector in terms of, again, community resiliency, in terms of community support for particularly the most vulnerable people. There have been some initiatives, particularly federally, to look at supporting the not-for-profit sector. I know that Kathy, you were talking about the funds that have been earmarked for the futures organizations across the country, and even Cowichan Futures. But I recognize that this is going to be a big struggle for the not-for-profit sector on so many fronts, and so much of the volunteer-driven and not-for-profit sector really relies on us coming together. And that's becoming such a challenge in this time. And as we keep hearing, that challenge is probably going to remain at some level for a very long time. So it is a question we raised with when we were in the legislature on March 23rd, and we will continue to raise it provincially about the kinds of supports that the province can be bringing forward for the not-for-profit sector. And we will continue to pursue that as an important part of that resiliency. Julie, is there any thought of the province either matching or contributing in some way to the new student funding that the feds announced this morning? I will look into that. I've been in contact with the president of VIU. I've also heard from a lot of particularly university students who are feeling that they are falling between the cracks. I don't have details on that new funding from this morning. I will get those updates from our staff today. And I think that as particularly post-secondary education is such a significant component of provincial jurisdiction, we would be wanting to see the province doing what it can at this point to support both students and post-secondary education institutions. Education is going to be a very significant part of recovery from this, and recognizing that as we reshape the economy, that we absolutely want to be in BC a knowledge-based economy, a highly educated population, and we know that education is such a significant determinant of people's economic sort of security, as well as the benefits it brings all around. So innovation, education have to be so central to what we're doing. Gretchen, thank you for your attention to not-for-profit, because they do provide much needed services and they employ many. And Gretchen, I spent a lot of time in the not-for-profit realm before I got into teaching. And you know, I was an administrator for a national charity for several years, and recognized not only the benefits in the efforts that charity was making at reducing global poverty, but the benefits it had in the communities and employment in those communities across the country, and making that mandate happen. And so I'm you know, very connected to the not-for-profit sector, and so well aware of the value that they bring. Eric, 3 times multiplying effect with provincial government funding being spent in the province alone. Yes. Imagine if all the profits and gross revenues from businesses stayed in the province or in Canada. What kind of multiplier effect in the economy would that create? One of the things we're doing in our Green Caucus is really connecting with a group of economists and economists who have been at the forefront of envisioning a kind of a new approach to economic decision making that really focuses on how do economies operate in a way that they serve people and communities, as well as be strong and sustainable and healthy. When we talk about things like the Greens wanting to have genuine progress indicators built into our budgeting process, while GDP measures one thing, and that's growth, and we know that by the measure of GDP, we're going to be hitting some of the worst markers, economic markers, in a long time. If we start implementing now in our period of recovery, a new lens on how do we have an economy that actually serves what we want, and we put those genuine progress indicators into our measurements as government, it then shows us exactly what you're talking about, these multiplier effects, the effects on health and well-being that economic and spending decisions are having. And we start to have a more holistic view of both how we spend money as government, but also how businesses do contribute, and you know, the whole sector of this economy, the small, the medium-sized business, the not-for-profit sector, that they contribute to the well-being of our communities and to the province in ways that we don't necessarily measure and take for granted in way too many ways. So genuine progress indicators will be one way for us to begin to properly measure and account for how well both government spending and contributions of businesses are working. And Eric, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about global economics and the impacts that this pandemic is having on supply chains, on you know, sort of highlighting the cracks in our resiliency, everything from food security to what we're seeing on impacts in small and medium businesses. So we absolutely have to say, okay, we don't want to be in the same place next time around. We want to be in a different place. We want to be in a stronger, more resilient place. And how do we get there? How do we learn the lessons that we're learning right now to get us there? We don't want to replicate the same conditions that have put us into this place. Leisha, in what ways is the province supporting public primary and secondary education right now? What is being done to improve and strengthen the medical system? Are funds being allocated to train future medical professionals? Great questions, Leisha. So in terms of public education right now, primary and secondary, as any of you with parents know, and right before we started, my daughter was here and I had to get her set up on her Zoom meeting with her class before I got on my Zoom meeting. That teachers are being, very innovative and creative in how they are connecting with their students right now. And of course, that's going to be different for a grade 2 class than it is for a grade 12 class. And that the government has recognized that students are going to need the support and not suffer unintended consequences. For example, not graduating. We don't want that to happen. I know that looking at can schools possibly reopen over the next weeks and before the end of year happens is a question that obviously is being mostly driven by the provincial health officer and her determination of where we're at with our cases. It was unfortunate to hear of another breakout, a cluster in the meat processing plant in Vancouver yesterday. And these are the kinds of things that obviously create worry for decision makers about how we're going to reopen. The medical system, I am, again, deeply heartened. Every conversation I've had with health officers, with the Minister of Health, with anybody involved in the medical system is recognizing that this again is a time of extraordinary innovation, that we have moved to virtual care literally in the space of days so that people can access their family doctors online or just this way through a phone call or through a Zoom call. My friend is a GP and she, when I talked to her 2 or 3 weeks ago, she'd already moved about 80% of her clinical visits to virtual visits. This has been a technology that's been available but hadn't been really leaned into, and I think it has great potential to ease some of the pressure on the health system. But overall, I think what's really important for us to recognize is that public health has been, in a lot of ways, sidelined for several decades. We've focused on the medical system as a system that gets people better, that helps people recover from illness or injury. We focus on that end of the medical system. And what is becoming really apparent and really clear right now is that investments into public health are absolutely necessary for keeping our entire health system, functioning as best it can, but have this enormous payoff. So when and recognizing that public health has such a significant range of what kind of investments, it's everything from our communities being more walkable and bike rideable, it's access to transportation, to public transportation, it's access to more home supports for everybody from newborn babies and their mothers to elderly living at home and aging at home. That when we invest in public health, we actually diminish the burden on the healthcare system as an acute treatment part of what it is, and that's the more expensive end of things. So I know that there's a lot of conversations happening right now, everything from restructuring health authorities, restructuring how health care is delivered, but also truly recognizing, as we've seen in this pandemic, that it is our provincial health officer, it is our public health officers who are at the forefront of the solutions in this crisis. And we need to keep public health really at the forefront and center of our thinking about healthcare. and then our funds being allocated to train future medical professionals. We have had, of course, a shortage of doctors in BC, and particularly family doctors. This has been an ongoing issue. When I've met with GPs and family doctors, again, the emphasis that I've heard from them has been around the structure and the challenges that they face as being, on the one hand, general practitioners and doctors, and on the other hand, small business owners, and having that kind of that double burden. And I know that there's efforts that were underway already to look at some pretty significant restructuring of how we deliver care, and that would include, ideally having more health professionals trained, but also more support for family doctors, who are really, like small business, are really such a foundational part of the healthcare system. So those conversations have been ongoing and will need to continue. Carol asks about not-for-profits could seize this situation as opportunities for better collaboration and coming together with like service providers for improved partnerships and operating structures. One board overseeing the multiple programs that used to be done through multiple societies, pool resources, avoid duplication, share operating costs. We'll be doing things differently, and we'll need to be more efficient and resilient. Again, Carol, I so appreciate this, this comment and these ideas. And I think as we recognize how important it's so interesting and ironic that in this pandemic and crisis, where we all have to be apart from each other, we're all also coming to terms very much with how much we all depend on each other, and that mutual dependence and support and cooperation has been so integral to how we've responded to this. Sorry, I've got a puppy. There we go. and moving out of this, opening up that conversation about really leaning into our connectivity and how strong it makes us to be more connected with each other, to break down silos in our communities, across sectors, and to be looking at how do we best support each other. And this is a really interesting thing about small and medium businesses, is that they have that already built-in culture of supporting and cooperating with each other. The not-for-profit sector obviously is built on this idea that we all want to contribute to a better society, to a better world, in whatever way we can. And I think that I again come back to my sort of overarching philosophy about community resiliency and community connectivity. And if we can emerge from this, and if our recovery is deeply rooted in that kind of connectivity that we're creating virtually right now, I think we are all going to be so much better for it. We're all going to benefit from it. And we're going to recognize that as we support each other, it actually benefits all of us to approach how we're doing things in that way. And so I really do appreciate that vision and that approach, Carol. Catherine, in regards to the hotels being opened for the homeless, this is a great burden on the hoteliers, even though there is compensation that will come back to them. Has there been any thought in opening in the closed schools in the community to be used for this purpose, not the ones what we expect children to return to, the ones that have been closed for many years? I know that some of the ones that have been closed for many years would probably need pretty significant input of resources and work to bring them up to any kind of standard or code that they would need to be at. And as the approach to the homelessness crisis here in Cowichan, but across the whole province, I was on a call with Minister Simpson this morning about the supports and the rollouts that are coming to address the need to find safe shelter for people who are homeless right now. there are a growing number of efforts and supports coming in. Here in Cowichan, there was initially a fair bit of conversation about hotel spaces being used. That has been shifted towards more of a tent-based areas that would be allocated and would be provided with sanitation and access to bathrooms and access to supports, but not necessarily into hotel rooms. And so that plan is being moved forward through BC Housing. And I know that from what Minister Simpson was saying this morning, a lot of the shift has been away from looking at hotels and looking more at community centers or other potential sites across the province. And again, you know, a lot of people that are in the serving sector for the most vulnerable in our population are seeing that, for example, shifts around accessing safe supply, accessing more treatment and therapy for people that are suffering from addiction, and finding ways to provide supports for people to help them navigate out of homelessness and back into the community, I think is another top of mind conversation and an important one. And as we see, it takes when there's a crisis or a pandemic like this, and we recognize that this is not a tenable situation for any of us. And I know that in Duncan in particular, the business owners have been hard hit by impacts from the homelessness and opioid crisis here in the valley, and I'm very aware of that. And we do need to recognize that when we don't solve one problem, it creates cascading problems that become more and more challenging for more and more people. And I think, you know, seeing how we can move on that. And so there's a lot of conversations around that right now. Guy Dauncey is doing a lot of analysis and is writing a new ecologic and economic framework that the BC Greens might want to look at. Thanks to you, Eric. And I've known Guy for probably over 20 years. His wife, Carolyn, was one of my Aunt Noel's best friends. I was thinking about her just today because she and my Aunt Noel would always have plant sales at this time of year at my aunt's farm, Ravenhill, over in Saanich. And I remember, you know, as a young person, I would often get a bit of work, my entrepreneurial spirit, when they would be in this season of getting the plant sales up and running. And so, yeah, absolutely. We will look up Guy's presentation and reach out to Guy. Thank you. And so we've gotten to the ends of the questions. It's 12:30. Catherine or Carrie, are there any further points or questions you'd like me to touch on?
Sorry, Sonia, finding my my unmute button there. We could leave it open for a couple minutes and just give anybody the opportunity to be brave enough who has a question to come in. We've certainly learned a lot. An hour's worth of information packed into our lives is a lot. All very helpful stuff.
Yeah, I'm not used to being the only voice talking for this long. So if somebody else wants to jump in, that'd be great.
Yeah, so true. Looks as though we're getting some thank yous and goodbyes on our on the chat line. Lots of people appreciative of your time today.
Oh, I so appreciate the opportunity to connect with everybody today, and I really appreciate what you're doing to make these forums come together and to keep people connected. It's really, really essential and important.
We would agree, and it's always nice to get you in front of the folks with the burning questions, and so thank you for that. So I think that brings us to an end, and I'm happy to close it there. Maybe yourself or Maeve can just remind everybody if something comes to mind later and they'd like to pose it or bring it to you, how's best to do that?
So Email sonia.firstnow.mla@leg.bc.ca. We also have a website, and that's that's soniafirstnowmla.ca, and that there Maeve's put it up. So there's our contact information. And if you send an email, like I said, our emails get triaged, but if it's specific to this, just mention, it's related to this, and we'll get it to the right people and get answers back to you.
Very good. And just a reminder to everybody who's on the call today, as mentioned by myself right off the top, in an effort to keep you folks really well informed and help you connect easier to all the resources and programs being rolled out, please visit the Cowichan Strong website. So that's cowichanstrong.ca. And it's a really good one-stop for all the programs ranging from the different levels of government and even sector programs. So a good place to start in any information search.
Yep, I signed up for that website last week. It's great.
Very good. Thank you, Sonia.
Yeah, it's
excellent.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, with that, we'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you for everyone who signed on today. We hope it's an hour well spent. And thank you, Sonia.
Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure. Thanks so much.
And everyone have a great day.
Bye-bye.